Hi, folks. Welcome back. I've argued previously that there's a lot of important connections between Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, but I think there's another half to the story. There's some essential differences between them. There's a lot at stake in deciding between them. So if you're drawn to similarities in the two positions here, you still have to decide which of these positive ideals do you find more compelling? Because Kierkegaard's positive ideal of the knight of faith, the Kierkegaardian hero, really is fundamentally different than the Nietzschean hero, the artist or the free spirit. And so we have to figure out what's at stake between them. What I want you to do first is pause your videos and try to answer this question. What do you think are the important differences? How would Nietzsche critique and disagree with things in Kierkegaard? So see if you can articulate some of the things that Nietzsche would take issue with in Kierkegaard's view. Okay, that was your chance to pause your videos. I mean, obviously, there's a huge difference with them over the question of theism. Kierkegaard believes in God. He is the arch Christian and theist and thinks that you can't explain the meaning of the human condition except in his Christian terms. And Nietzsche is the opposite. Nietzsche thinks God is dead. He is the arch atheist. But nonetheless, remember, even though they do disagree on this question, Nietzsche uses Christian symbols and reinterprets Christian symbolism continually in his work. I think what he's doing there is he is showing how we have to be creators with our history. That's precisely what he tells us that the free spirit does, is they take what history has given to them and they reinterpret it or they make it significant in certain ways. That is precisely what Nietzsche is trying to do with the history of Christianity. So his use of Christian symbols at a certain level might not be that fundamentally different than Kierkegaard's. But this video is about their differences. So I'm going to tell you actually the differences do run deep. Because what is important about religious conviction? Well, for Nietzsche, any kind of religious conviction, something like Kierkegaard's unconditional commitment that gives yourselves fundamental meaning, has to be deeply suspect. Because having something give your life unconditional commitment, Nietzsche thinks that is a crutch. In fact, Kierkegaard is falling prey to the exact crutch that religion has always promised us. It allows us to divest responsibility for the truth, for admitting that there is no fundamental absolute source of meaning, and we have to make whatever contingent meaning we possibly can. So the honesty to admit nihilism and Nietzsche's own radical nihilism or active nihilism is something that he thinks Kierkegaard fundamentally misses out on. And that is the key insight for Kierkegaard's free spirit or artist. So even though Kierkegaard really follows and has a lot of similarities to Nietzsche, I think Nietzsche's deepest criticism was Kierkegaard fails at the final moment to fully get rid of the religious way of thinking. And I think this passage from the Gay Science 347 really typifies the kind of criticism Nietzsche would make of Kierkegaard. This is not just a criticism of religion in general or traditional Christianity. I think Nietzsche would say this Kierkegaard still falls prey to this issue because, you know, the Bible talks about these proofs of strength. You know, how deep is your faith? What kind of strength is your faith? And Kierkegaard takes this up. And Kierkegaard saying you need to have the ability to believe on the strength of the absurd. And that kind of firmness of belief is precisely a kind of need to believe in your own significance that Nietzsche is diagnosing as a deep problem of religious mindsets. So he says, you know, believers and their need to believe, how much one needs a faith in order to flourish, how much that is firm, and that one does not wish to be shaken because one clings to it. That's a measure of one's strength. Or what he means is that's inversely a measure of one's strength because it's a measure of one's weakness. How much you need something absolutely firm, like an unconditional commitment in order to believe that life is meaningful, then that's a sign of how weak you are. Because Nietzsche's free spirit, like I think from Nietzsche's point of view, Kierkegaard follows him or goes along with him, like for the first 9 steps of the philosophical journey. They agree about 9 different things, but it's the final one on which it all hangs. And Nietzsche would say, if Kierkegaard isn't finally willing to admit the nihilism and give up on this need for unconditional commitments and become a free spirit, then he's just as problematic as everybody else. So this, I think, is the fundamental point at which they would really disagree. It's not just one passage that this comes across. In many places in the Gay Science or in the Antichrist, in Nietzsche's other writings, we see this idea that the free spirit must really have the ability to find contingent meaning, to find non-absolute meaning, for life to be meaningful, even though there is no fundamental source of meaning. So here's the passage from Gay Science 375. we are cautious, we modern men, about ultimate convictions. Our mistrust lies in wait for the enchantments and deceptions of the conscience that are involved in every strong faith, every unconditional yes and no. Well, I think this applies to traditional Christianity, and it also applies to Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard also buys the idea that ultimate convictions, an unconditional commitment to something, that strength of faith, the strength of faith that is so strong it admits the absurdity and the paradox and holds on anyway, that is deeply problematic for Nietzsche, and that it interferes with admitting the radical truths that fundamentally the world does not have meaning, and we have to create radically contingent meaning for ourselves. Now, to illustrate how complicated the issue is, though, think about this other passage from The Gay Science. This is one that I've quoted in some other videos, this idea about dogmatism, because I think in some sense, what a dogma is it's a fundamental conviction. And when we say a person is being dogmatic, it means they're not giving up on certain principles. So in some ways, you would think Kierkegaard's Knight of Faith is deeply dogmatic. So maybe one of the criticisms Nietzsche might make of Kierkegaard is the Knight of Faith is dogmatic, and the free spirit has to get rid of that, has to be completely anti-dogmatic. But this, I think, shows how subtle Kierkegaard's view is. So I think Kierkegaard does have some things to respond here. Because I think Kierkegaard would say, it's not true. If what Nietzsche means by dogmatist is that their truth is supposed to be a truth for everyone, then he misunderstands my view. Because Kierkegaard precisely is saying we can have an unconditional commitment that is not universal. That's what's so fascinatingly paradoxical about Kierkegaard. So Kierkegaard is saying we need ultimate meaning, but it's not in the traditional way. And maybe Nietzsche's criticisms are missing the mark slightly. So even though I think Nietzsche does have some deep criticisms of Kierkegaard, I think at the same time, I want to give Kierkegaard the chance to respond because Kierkegaard does have an interesting and subtle view. So here's my slide for Kierkegaard responses. There are certain ways in which Kierkegaard is really happy with the levels of agreement he has with Nietzsche. I think Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are so united on rejecting asceticism and on redeeming the temporal. I think Kierkegaard, I said this previously, but I think Kierkegaard would absolutely love Nietzsche's concept of the eternal recurrence. But what it comes down to, the difference is, they do disagree on abandoning Christianity. But at a certain level, I think that doesn't go deep enough, because in certain ways, Nietzsche uses Christian symbols, and in many ways, Kierkegaard, I think, existentially reinterprets Christian symbols. So the deeper difference, I think, comes over this concept of the artist and what I was talking about before as being the final step that the free spirit is able to achieve in giving up on any need for absolute meaning. For Kierkegaard, the artist or the free spirit who can find meaning in one endeavor for one day and then switch to something else as being meaningful a different day. They can, pursue one profession and one cause for 5 years. And then after that ends, they can pursue another cause. That's what Nietzsche thinks of as the free spirit. Well, for Kierkegaard, this is just a return to lower immediacy, the ascetic or the sensual. This is not being able to find an unconditional commitment. And you are just going back from the ethical down to the realm of the ascetic and lower immediacy. So I think Kierkegaard would criticize Nietzsche's positive ideal just as much as Nietzsche would criticize Kierkegaard's. So now, despite all of those connections, hopefully you see that there is something at stake. Do we need a fundamental life-guiding purpose or not? Can we get on without one? Or, maybe you think a lot of humans have to get on without one because we can't find the kind of the temporal and the contingent commitment that Knights of Faith do. But you might still think that Kierkegaard's right about the ideal human life. The best way to live is the one with one of these unconditional commitments. It's our lot, perhaps, that many of us don't ever get there. But Nietzsche is saying, no, that's not even the best way to live. The best way to live is to not even need a kind of unconditional commitment in the first place. And that's what you have to decide between if you find Kierkegaard or Nietzsche more compelling or more plausible. So, let me finally sum up. What I really think it comes down to is this question of nihilism. Nietzsche's final step, this thing that he called his positive nihilism. Remember, I've said previously, there's sort of good nihilism and bad nihilism. And Nietzsche's good nihilism, the thing that he thinks is what we should embrace, radical nihilism in this quote, is what Kierkegaard stops at. This is not the place Kierkegaard's willing to follow Nietzsche to. And so you have to decide if you find that more compelling. Because the absolute untenability of existence with regard to highest values, they both agree with this being a problem when we posit a beyond, a heaven, or another realm. So Kierkegaard would agree, if we need to seek that in the beyond, then we're deeply troubled, and that's problematic. We can get by without the value of a beyond. So Kierkegaard will actually follow Nietzsche partially here. But Kierkegaard thinks in the temporal world, then, we need to recreate those highest values. We need to recreate eternity in time. And Nietzsche is saying, no, we don't even need to do that. We need to get beyond highest values, period. And we need to embrace the radical contingency of our values, the perspectival nature of all of our values. So here's a really interesting irony when you think about some of these points I made about Nietzsche's nihilism previously. You see, I said Nietzsche agrees with this thesis here, that there's no such thing as absolute meaning. And if one believes in this green thing, that all meaning has to be absolute, then you're going to go to this further step of nihilism and believe there's no meaning at all. Nietzsche does not embrace this. This is a kind of, I called this sort of ascetic nihilism. This is deeply problematic nihilism that Nietzsche doesn't embrace. And Kierkegaard also does not embrace this kind of nihilism. But oddly, this is the funny thing. So they both disagree with this pink quote, but Kierkegaard, I think, buys the green one. Kierkegaard does think the highest ideal for a human is to have an absolute sort of meaning. This is what we need as humans. What Kierkegaard disagrees with is that there can be no absolute meaning. So Kierkegaard has to disagree with Nietzsche's nihilism at that point, even Nietzsche's sort of own first nihilistic thesis. Kierkegaard just thinks we have to create that kind of absolute meaning in our own lives through these unconditional commitments, because we don't get it from some supernatural heavenly realm like the afterlife. Okay, so that's a sense in which I think they really do disagree about nihilism, and that's another way of thinking about what's at stake between the two. Now, let me say, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche actually were almost contemporaries. So Kierkegaard was a generation older than Nietzsche. Kierkegaard was born in the early 1800s, 30 years before Nietzsche. So their lives actually overlapped a little bit. And what is so tragic from his philosophical, historical point of view is Kierkegaard died quite young, when he was 40, when Nietzsche was only 10 years old. And Nietzsche hardly encountered Kierkegaard's works in his lifetime, in part because Kierkegaard was such an idiosyncratic thinker and he was so tied to the intellectual world of Copenhagen, he didn't get this global following yet. And so Nietzsche, sadly, did not actually encounter his works. If Nietzsche could have read Fear and Trembling, it would have just been amazing, because he could have written directly. We would understand both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche both so much better if we could have let him respond. For one thing, they were both such socially ostracized, solitary, and tragic individuals. They would have sort of deeply bonded, I think, and could have found somewhat of a soulmate and could really have been happy together, debating their theism and atheism. So it's really just a tragedy for them and for us that Kierkegaard and Nietzsche could never meet or could never encounter each other's works. If Kierkegaard would have lived longer, he might have actually read some Nietzsche and vice versa, and it just would have been absolutely amazing. So Nietzsche had several folks who he corresponded with in letters, and several good friends. George Brandes was one of them. And he actually was telling him, look, I've encountered this Nordic author Kierkegaard, and you have got to read this guy. He would interest you deeply. He's one of the most deep psychologists ever. I mean, I think there's things like what Brandes is noticing here is the really deep existential ideas in Kierkegaard. And he realizes, oh, Nietzsche would eat this stuff up. And Nietzsche says, okay, you're right, I'm going to read it. So he writes back in his reply letter and says, okay, I'm going to do a deep dive into Kierkegaard. But sadly, I don't know, this year 1888 stands out in the history of Nietzsche. At the end of this year, Nietzsche went mad. He had a complete mental breakdown, a complete psychosis, and became comatose eventually. He had strokes in his life. There's a lot of unknowns about what was the basis of this. I'll talk in another video about it as well. But so tragically, right when Nietzsche is at the end of his life, his mental, philosophical, productive life, he realizes he's going to encounter Kierkegaard, and then he just gets there too late and doesn't get to do a deep dive into Kierkegaard's works. So this, it was within a year. Nietzsche only had to live 1 year longer, and we would have seen this intellectual flourishing. Okay, so let me go back to this final question now that we've really talked about the similarities and differences between Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. So where would you place Nietzsche on this chart? You can pause your videos again if you'd like, if you didn't decide previously, or to revise your answers. I'll pause for 1 second to let you pause your videos if you wish. Okay, now the big reveal. Well, perhaps it's totally obvious, but I put Nietzsche way down here in this corner. And I think that what this really shows is some of the similarities between him and Kierkegaard. They both are radically individualistic in their sources of meaning and how we find meaning in our lives. But they end up diametrically opposed on the other dimension. I mean, Nietzsche fundamentally embraces the nihilism and the naturalism, and Kierkegaard instead will not follow him in that final step to nihilism, and instead uses this religious conception and religious set of symbols as being essential to explaining the human condition. Okay, thanks.